morning, everyone. Hope you're doing well. As the Environmental Policy Director at the USC Schwarzenegger Institute, I am pleased to welcome you to this 90-minute webinar. This event is co-hosted by the LA County Sustainability Office, the UCLA Luskin Center, and the LA Business Council to provide a greater public awareness of LA County's climate vulnerability assessment. You'll hear it being referred to as the CVA. The purpose of today's meeting is to inform residents, workers, and businesses of LA County about some of the strategies that may be needed to be adopted in order to adapt to a rapidly changing climate. Protecting the health and safety of our residents, essential workers, and the economic vitality of our businesses will require all of our attention and collective action. I think back to just last week. It was 100 degrees near where I lived after going through the driest January, February in history. As you can see, we have a lot of work to do. Just over 2 years ago, the LA County Board of Supervisors unanimously adopted our county's bold, ambitious, and comprehensive sustainability plan. Now for the hard part, implementation. As a county with 10 million people, how do we make our communities healthier, more equitable, and economically stronger by both mitigating and adapting to the challenges of a changing climate? We will be hearing today from 3 opening speakers: County Board of Supervisor Chair Holly Mitchell, Chief Sustainability Officer for LA County Gary Giroux, and the Insurance Commissioner for California, Ricardo Lara, before we switch to a panel discussion of the key climate adaptation strategies we may want to focus on. That panel will be moderated by the CEO of the Better World Group, Cecilia Estelano, and include an excellent panel of experts consisting of Mary Leslie she's president of the LABC, that's the Los Angeles Business Council, Jisung Park, assistant professor of UCLA, Elizabeth Rhodes, the director of LA County Public Health, Climate, and Sustainability Programs, and Chris Hannon, executive director of the Building Trades for LA and Orange County. There will be an opportunity for the audience to submit a question in the chat to any of the prior speakers. Background information on the speakers are online as part of the information of the CBA event. Before we begin with the chair of the Board of Supervisors, I would also like to take a moment to thank the Schwarzenegger Institute, led by Conyers Davis, Francisca Martinez, and Allison Kay, for helping coordinate this event on behalf of the LA County Sustainability Office. We hope you will find this event informative as we identify the impacts of a changing climate that are accelerating far faster than we had ever anticipated. I mean, last week's report from the LAO and other reports confirmed of the need for a call to action. Unlike 20 years ago, when California's first climate bill was signed to reduce the emissions from vehicles, we can actually now see, feel, and breathe in LA County some of the impacts of climate change. From the health and economic impacts due to extreme heat events, to a dramatic increase in wildfires, disruptions from power shutoffs, extended periods of drought, and the potential for increased flooding or sea level rise, and the potential for other problems as well, we are literally in a race against time. How do we protect people and our economy as we try to reduce harmful emissions and adapt to a changing climate? Let's hear from our first speaker, Holly Mitchell, for some opening remarks. The county's Chief Sustainability Officer, Gary Giroux, will follow her with an overview of the CDA. And then our Insurance Commissioner, Ricardo Lara, will join us to talk about the health and property challenges that may be impacted by a changing climate. Our following panel of experts will be led by Cecilia Estelano, who will be joined by several other members as well, and she will introduce them when we get to that portion. If you have questions along the way, please don't hesitate to put a question in the chat, and time permitting, we will ask them to the speakers. So let's get started. LA County Supervisor Holly Mitchell, you're up.
Hey, Fran, good morning. It's so great to see you again on the Zoom. It's sort of like our configuration on the Senate floor where I sat behind you. So I'm glad to see you, glad to know that you're continuing your career-long work focused on climate at USC, at the Schwarzenegger Institute. So thank you so much for inviting me today. I'm glad to be able to join you and our other former colleague, now Insurance Commissioner Ricardo Lara. So this is a good way to start Monday, just like we were on the floor of the Senate. And as Fran very clearly pointed out, we're here today because all of you who are participating, you know the facts and you know the science. The latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change gives us a now or never ultimatum to act. And clearly our lives hang in the balance. Climate change is no doubt a crisis, and one that we've got to mobilize our resources and expand our political imagination to address. We have many, many lessons, far too many, from our COVID-19 pandemic that we can apply to how we address climate change. The pandemic reminded everyone that our fate is shared and that how we protect the most vulnerable and least served in our community will determine our collective resilience. The pandemic highlighted the severe inequities in our society that have assigned risk and a vulnerability to Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and other people of color, as well as poor and working class communities. These are the same communities that are impacted by climate change. And because of these very inequities, it requires that we take immediate, swift, proactive, shall I say, disruptive action. We have a vision set forth based on a board-adopted policy that created our county sustainability plan, which is an equity-focused, community-driven, and people-centered roadmap for a healthier, more resilient future for all of us. We are equipped with the data included in our recently released Climate Vulnerability Assessment, which is helping us understand the most pressing challenges and risks posed by our changing environment. A result of the assessment taught us, or one of the issues in the assessment highlighted, for me in particular, that extreme heat will increase in frequency, severity, and duration, anticipating up to a 10-fold increase by 2050. Well, quite frankly, in some areas of my district today, where we lack tree canopy, temperatures can reach an average of up to 10 degrees hotter simply due to the lack of shade. That's today. So imagine amplifying that tenfold by 2050. Clearly, we have to do something different. That's just another example of the structural inequities we are seeking to correct every day in LA County as we build back equitably. Our county, I'm very proud to say, is leading the nation with its Just Transition Task Force that's convening diverse stakeholders across sectors to develop a proactive solution to protect workers and frontline communities as we begin to phase out our reliance on fossil fuels. When we passed that motion, Fran, I thought about you and our collective work in the legislature. This collaboration presents an opportunity to build an economy that works for every Angelino, while also leveraging the influx of public investment and programs like the state's Community Economic Resilience Fund to support our just transition. So with these tools and systems already in place and supported by our Chief Sustainability Office, you'll hear from Gary shortly, now is the time for the hard conversations and the cross-jurisdictional collaboration that make bold action possible. Defining moments present enormous possibility for growth and innovation, if only we have the courage to lean in. And we have the opportunity before us to advance an equity-centered climate agenda that reduces the disproportionate health impacts of pollution on our frontline communities. A climate agenda that protects our essential workforce and creates more pathways to high road union jobs. So for me, it's not a either or, it's a both and we can. And one that delivers community-driven solutions and a better quality of life for everybody. It's not an easy road, but it's clearly a necessary one. So I look forward to today's conversation and our collective shared future and hope that we will work better collaboratively to create the kind of LA County that we all want to grow old in and raise our children to thrive. I look forward to today's presentations. Thanks a million, Fran.
Good morning, everybody. This is Gary Giroux, the LA County Chief Sustainability Officer. And thanks so much to Chair Mitchell and to Senator Pavley. It's such an honor to be able to be on the same virtual dais with them. And great thanks, of course, to the USC Schwarzenegger Institute, UCLA Luskin Center, and all the other partners for today's event. You've heard an awful lot about climate change already. So I'm not going to repeat some of that, but I do want to say, just before I start, ordinarily in these kinds of events, we would have Insurance Commissioner Lara go next as an elected official. But his remarks actually take off from some of the information I'm about to provide. And so I get the honor of going before him, and he'll be able to respond to some of the things that I'm going to present to you here today. So, of course, we know that climate change is a huge risk. We'll start here with a picture of LA icon Clayton Kershaw, only because to point out that, as you probably recall, the 2017 World Series was the hottest World Series game ever played in the history of over 100 years of World Series games. And not the hottest by a little bit, but the hottest by a lot. I think the previous high was something in the 94, 95 degrees in Phoenix, of course, where you would expect that kind of temperature. This was 103 degrees in LA. And, we, of course, saw just last week, as Senator Pavley pointed out, new records being broken on extreme heat in Southern California. And it used to be, I'm old enough to remember when we broke a heat record or any kind of weather-related record, it was always, it stood for 40 years, or it had stood, the record had stood for 60 years. Now our records stand for 2 or 3 years because we just see an acceleration of extreme heat and extreme weather. And I think that really points out the critical nature of the kind of work that we did. So why don't we get into the details of the climate vulnerability assessment? Let's see if the slides will change. Yes, they will. So the first question really is what is vulnerability? And we want to be very clear here that we're not talking about any individual weakness, but we're talking about sensitivity. And the critical thing, and the thing that we did in this climate vulnerability assessment, was we looked at climate hazards across the county. So, of course, heat, drought, wildfire, inland flooding, coastal flooding, looked at that at a census tract scale. So we took this global information and really downscaled it to the census tract scale. And then we married that with sensitivity information. So how sensitive are populations to that exposure? And then we considered their adaptive capacity. You may be very sensitive, but you also may have the ability to crank up your air conditioning and air filtration system, or to just get in your car and go to someplace cooler. Not everyone has those luxuries. And so we did want to consider that. So the next slide, want to say then that what we did is actually took that kind of downscaled climate information and looked at it relative to a number of factors. On the social side, we looked at actually 29 specific categories across these 10 or 8 rather broad tiers. So things like health status or age or occupation. Are you an indoor-outdoor worker? Those kinds of, that kind of really deep quantitative assessment. We did the same thing for infrastructure. And again, we did this across all of LA County, as this is a countywide climate vulnerability assessment. And it really helped us to understand who and what is vulnerable to what kinds of climate impacts where. And I think that's the critical thing, is once you now know who or what is vulnerable to the kinds of climate impacts that you're expecting and where those impacts are likely to occur, then as government policymakers, we can start to design programs and responses to protecting our communities. Next slide. So let's talk about some of the findings. Not a surprise probably to any of you that extreme heat is one of the most significant impacts. And I'm going to go into these in detail one by one, but just point this out. We also recognize that we're going to see areas of coastal flooding. In some cases, we'll see increases, and in some cases, we'll see decreases. So inland flooding may change in the future, as will wildfire and wildfire exposure. But across all of these, we know that the events are going to become more frequent. They're going to become more severe and longer lasting. Couple of key points here. The first is, as we think about communities, and this is just a sample of the kinds of results that we got, that in places like Reseda and Winnetka, out in the San Fernando Valley, we're going to see some real extreme heat. And we saw that in those census tracts, there are a number of people who have limited English households or have people with health conditions. And that's the kind of results that allows us to start to design responses. And similarly, in the Long Beach and San Pedro area, we're going to see extreme flooding, of course. And a lot of the places where we're likely to see flooding are in fact, low-income households. And of course, in Santa Clarita, we know that heat and wildfire are significant impacts. We also know that there's a lot of older adults in the Santa Clarita area, and there's very poor public transportation. So people with limited mobility may have difficulty escaping. Again, just a sample of the kinds of findings that the vulnerability assessment in its nearly 200 pages has revealed to us. So let me start then with a little bit more deep dive on extreme heat. And just to say, this is going to be widespread. Chair Mitchell pointed out a tenfold increase. And what that means is that today, the most extreme heat events, which are those that are considered at the 98th percentile for temperature and last over 4 days, occur about every other year. So every other year we get a four-day extremely hot period. We project at mid-century that'll happen actually twice a year. So a tenfold increase in the number of those kinds of heat events. And heat can affect people in a number of ways. If you're have an underlying health condition, it can trigger things like severe asthma or heart attacks. It really has a significant impact on people who are pregnant or to young adults. It actually can decrease cognitive function, and so harms mental health. And when we think about extreme heat, you don't always think about heat-related workers' compensation issues, right? So if somebody falls off a ladder, you don't say it's because of the heat. You say it was an accident to slip and fall, but it could be that people are heat stressed or otherwise impacted by the heat that leads to those kinds of injuries. So we know that this is a significant impact. Let's talk about extreme heat's impacts on workers, because we know this is a major topic. And one of the populations that we looked at were outdoor workers. And even outdoor workers, sometimes, you could be an indoor worker, say at a warehouse, it's exposed to the outdoors because it's not air conditioned. But when we looked at this in detail, we really saw significant impacts, whether it's people who suffer from the kinds of accidents that I just described. We know that people actually there's higher absenteeism during heat waves. And if you look at the maps, you'll see where these kinds of impacts are distributed. again, not surprising, lower income communities, communities of color. In fact, when you think about outdoor workers, a much higher percentage of the population that's Black are outdoor workers than they are representative of the overall population. So certainly racialized impacts to this as well. Of course, what we know that we've all experienced here in LA, more frequent, larger heat or wildfires. And wildfire, of course, can have a huge impact on older adults, people who live alone, people with limited access to transportation. And while we didn't map, and you can't really map in any realistic way, wildfire smoke, because it is also idiosyncratic depending on the conditions and the location of the fire, we know that smoke from wildfires has a huge impact as well on our populations. And again, people with underlying respiratory illness are particularly impacted. Our people experiencing homelessness are much more exposed, of course, to these types of impacts. And we know that wildfire smoke is likely to increase just as wildfires are likely to increase. So move on to precipitation and flooding. We don't think about here in Los Angeles inland flooding in the same way that you do in other communities. But in fact, we know from our assessment that, of course, we're going to experience more frequent and longer and more profound droughts. But those droughts actually, the science tells us, are going to be punctuated by instances of extreme precipitation. So when we do get rain, it's going to rain a lot all at once rather than spread out over time. And that can lead to severe inland flooding. And we know that, again, I think our analysis pointed out that about 700,000 people in LA County, so a large percentage of the population, or a significant percentage of the population, are at some level of risk. And nearly a third of people living in mobile homes are at risk from extreme flooding. So again, one that sometimes gets overlooked given wildfire and heat, but is certainly significant in and of its own right here in Los Angeles. And then, of course, sea level rise, we know is already starting to impact our coastal areas and is going to have a much more significant impact as we project flooding heights of as much as 4 feet in certain parts of the county. The areas that are most exposed, of course, are the ports, Long Beach area, the marina, and parts of the Pacific Coast Highway is at severe risk, particularly in the northern part of the county between Santa Monica and Malibu. And there are a number of people who are at risk of exposure from this kind of flooding. And then the last one I'll cover is droughts. And again, we are all living it now. We know it, and we continue to hear the messages about prolonged and devastating drought. You can just see historically the way droughts have occurred in Los Angeles County, that we are in a severe drought and are likely to continue to see significant impacts from those droughts. And, when you think about drought and the kinds of impacts it has, in some cases, it can lead to things like more dust, right? And dust affects people, again, with respiratory conditions. And in northern parts of the county, we just saw, I think, a report last week about the valley fever and additional or higher levels of exposure to the spores in the dust from valley fever. And so drought can really have significant public health impacts. And can also have impacts on some of our infrastructure, particularly our parks and open space infrastructure, which are so necessary to provide people with places of respite. And if we start to lose trees in our communities, we only exacerbate heat conditions. And then the last point I want to make on this, and I've mentioned this a bit, but not surprising to anyone, that vulnerabilities are highly racialized, and Hispanic or Latinx populations of LA County is about half of the county, but the population in the most severely impacted census tracts is about 2/3 Hispanic or Latinx, so severely or significantly disproportionately impacted by this. And, when we think about wildfire, of course, we think, oh, those expensive homes up in the hills are the ones that are most exposed. But one of the things we heard very clearly is that the workers in those homes, the domestic workers, are at risk. They sometimes rely on public transit to get to and from their workplaces in those homes, and public transit may be suspended. They may have to evacuate on foot. And we heard stories of people who were racially profiled as they were trying to evacuate some of these communities. I mentioned the Black Angelenos being a disproportionate part of our outdoor workforce, but we also know from FEMA data that Black households actually suffer greater losses and get less resources post-disaster than other communities. And so these are things that we need to keep in mind as we are, again, designing policies and programs. And then I'm gonna wrap up quickly just on the analysis we did on cascading impacts. We looked at how our infrastructure was interdependent, which is not surprising to anyone that it is. When our electricity goes out, it affects communications, it affects transportation, it can affect even water supply as water is pumped. And so we tried to map this, and this is a picture of the maps that we created. The next slide shows really the centrality of electricity as a node, but all of the other nodes that are critical as well are water and communications and transportation. These are all interconnected systems that when one part of them fail can lead to other failures. And lastly, what's important for today's conversation is to talk about how workforce availability is actually central to making sure these systems continue to function and function properly. We learned this, and Chair Mitchell mentioned, the lessons learned from the pandemic. We learned certainly during the pandemic the critical nature of essential workers. That's true in any climate disaster as well. If the communications worker or the utility worker can't get to their work location because parts of the system are down or can't be communicated with to be told to come into work, then of course the whole system starts to unravel. It's in a domino effect. So workforce is critical, and I don't think we need to be reminded of that. So I'm going to maybe just skip ahead here. So when we did do the mapping tool. So if you want to go online, you can go get more information and see all of this. You can get the report and the tools, and you can see what the impacts are in your communities. So with that, I want to thank everyone. Again, thanks for the opportunity to be here today. We are in the county acting on this assessment, and the board has now directed the creation of a climate resilience initiative to actually spearhead actions and policies around these impacts. Back to Senator Pavley.
Yes, thank you very much, Gary, for that comprehensive report, and everyone can find that online, as you pointed out. Excellent. So let's go on to my favorite insurance commissioner, Ricardo Lara. Hopefully you have joined us and you're ready to go.
Senator Pavley, I'm always ready, especially having you in charge of this beautiful event. So thank you again for inviting me. I'm excited to be here with two incredible leaders, Senator Fran Pavley, my former seatmate in the Senate, and of course, Chairwoman Holly Mitchell, my fellow former legislators who have really been champions on climate policy over the years. Los Angeles County Climate Vulnerability Assessment, I think is an essential part of climate policy here in LA County. My home is here in LA County. I grew up in unincorporated East Los Angeles in an industrial hub between two freeways on Union Pacific Boulevard. So I think the name of that street tells you everything. So this discussion on climate vulnerability is very personal to me. And Los Angeles is really facing realities of climate change now. Severe heat, as we were just hearing, frequent fires, poor air quality. And this is all really exacerbated by historical inequities that have really been concentrated in low-income communities in some of our highest risk areas. Building climate resilience requires both reducing risks and building the capacity to recover. And the best long-term resilience strategy is really a dramatic reduction in the emissions that cause climate change. Yet even as we move to really a low-carbon economy, past emissions have already locked in rising temperatures and increasing climate impacts for the foreseeable future. And we need to really seize every opportunity to adapt to and bounce back from climate intensified events. The insurance sector is, I believe, central to both sides of resilience. It is a tool for incentives to reduce physical climate risks and really drive behavioral change, and a contributor, to the economic recovery as well. So as California Insurance Commissioner, I regulate and oversee the largest insurance market in the world, fourth in the nation, fourth in the world. And when disaster strikes, even long after the news and the attention turns elsewhere, the Department of Insurance remains focused on helping policyholders rebuild and local communities recover in the wake of climate-related loss. So as an insurance regulator, my office is building a comprehensive approach to climate change, and we are leading a national effort by working with other states to make our new approach as impactful as possible. In July, I released the first ever climate insurance report, bringing together 40 recommendations that were developed during nearly 2 years of meetings by experts on risk and resiliency. These recommendations focus on how we combat the rising cost of climate change by protecting our most vulnerable communities, preserving nature, and building resiliency. We focused on, of course, extreme heat, wildfire, and flooding, because these are really threats facing Californians already today. That is especially true for the residents of LA County, where all three of these impacts are evident and impact an estimated 56% of county residents. As we heard earlier, heat waves are the most deadly impact of climate change that we are experiencing today in the US. And heat waves in cities are projected to cause 2 to 3 times more heat-related deaths by mid-century. In LA County, heat waves are projected to increase tenfold. But extreme heat impacts are largely uninsured and have lingering economic and health consequences, especially for our vulnerable communities. We need to treat extreme heat waves like other natural disasters and really better communicate the health risks to prepare communities for longer and hotter heat waves. Part of this is tracking heat waves, ranking them like we do hurricanes. And this is why out of that work, our insurance working group came out one of the recommendations of doing just that, tracking and ranking heat waves. I'm sponsoring legislation in the California legislature to do just that. This way we can trigger policies to give people and businesses the assistance they really need, opening cooling centers, preventing power outages, safer working conditions. In my time as a legislator, I worked to cut emissions of super pollutants such as HFC refrigerants, because we need to make sure that our solutions to one climate-related problem like extreme heat doesn't continue to worsen as the climate crisis continues to go on. So this is something that I've worked on with Senator Pavley, putting really a focus on rules and incentives that have really guided California's investment to clean trucks, These investments are coming to fruition today at our ports with new fleets of drayage trucks that really reduce emissions around our ports. To protect people, we also should be working with nature, not just against it, but really with solutions like urban forestry, urban greening, and investing in our wetlands and coastal marshes. Wildfire risk can continue to be a major risk and major issue, as we know, not just for the people living in fire-prone neighborhoods, but also for people in the valley or in the coast who are breathing in the smoke. I mean, we've done so much to curtail the negative impacts of pollutants in our atmosphere. With just one fire can set us back, years. And so that affects us statewide. In Los Angeles, we've been focusing really to clean up our air for decades, as I said, through emission standards, clean cars and trucks, and cutting emissions of super pollutants. So, I worked on this in the legislature for years. So, I understand how hard fought battles these have been, but now, that the progress is really at risk of becoming the battle is that progress is at risk because of smoke from catastrophic wildfires. Again, looking at our healthcare systems, which have been so burdened by the pandemic, also are dealing with hospitalizations from asthma, strokes, heart attacks from vulnerable people breathing in wildfire smoke. So again, I'm working to address this smoke, the issues around smoke at its source by using insurance as a tool to do that. The key is reducing wildfire risk for homes, businesses, and communities. And by reducing wildfire risk, we can save lives, protect property, protect the air that we breathe. And so my department recently launched the Safer from Wildfires program, which established a framework of wildfire safety measures that home and business owners can take. This really gives homeowners and businesses a list of scientifically sound and achievable actions to reduce wildfire risk. Mitigation is even more important, with more than 93% of the state now in severe extreme drought. We really know that dry conditions can lead to more fires ahead. Home hardening becomes critical, but we wanted to take a few moments today to really emphasize that some land management solutions have been used for hundreds of years. I recently spent time with the Yurok tribe in Northern California, where I participated in a training on cultural burning. Tribes in California have safely used fire to sustainably manage the forest and uphold their traditions for many generations. Access to insurance has been a challenge for tribes and other organizations that are trying to use prescribed burns to reduce risks. I'm working to ensure that tribes can access the insurance they need to facilitate cultural burn and in the process prevent these catastrophic fires. So finally, we need to be prepared for flooding. Flooding can be catastrophic, especially for renters who do not realize that they don't have coverage. All the areas in the state are subject to at least some form of flooding. Since 1992, every county in California has been declared a federal disaster area for at least one time for flooding. So by 2050, nearly 20% of LA County properties are projected to be at risk of flooding during a large storm event. And most vulnerable populations, as we know, and as we've been learning throughout the day, low-income communities of color have historically been pushed to the margins and will suffer disproportionately by climate impacts, including rising sea levels and flooding. So working with working with nature means looking at our coastal landscapes as a source of protection against flood. Just last year, I visited a restored wetland in Southern California that serves to protect neighborhoods around Seal Beach, which sits at the mouth of the San Gabriel River, which is a massive drainage for LA County. And on one side is a large senior housing development, and on the other side is a busy marina and tourist area. The cost to rebuild this area in a flooding disaster could be astronomical. So wetlands can actually be a natural barrier, doing dual duty to absorb the ocean storm surges and flooding that could come from upstream. This is a vision that local planners are already working on to make a reality. And then at the state level, I'm looking for ways to implement our climate insurance report, which supports communities in better preparing for climate change. The reality is that housing that burns down is repeatedly floods is not affordable. Increased health risks and extreme heat is not affordable. So insurance is a tool to incentivize prevention and a tool for promoting full equitable recovery. And I'm committed and will continue to find ways to make our vulnerable communities and our businesses safer from these climate-related threats. And I appreciate the work that LA County is doing to identify and assist our vulnerable communities in adapting to the increasing risk of climate change. Again, thank you for allowing me to share my thoughts and look forward again to partnering with LA County and all the great work that they're doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricardo. And I look forward to supporting your bill on ranking heat events, but even more importantly, your statewide approach to adopting safety measures so we can adapt to the worst impacts of climate change. Thanks for joining us. So let's move on to Cecilia Estelano and her expert panel.
Thanks, Fran. Thank you, Commissioner Lara. That was a tremendous presentation. It's so great to have somebody with so much experience and breadth of knowledge and breadth of perspective at the helm of that important state agency. We have a terrific panel. Maybe we can get people off of mute and get them on the screen. I'm just going to give a couple of remarks and then we're going to get right into it. We've heard a lot about the cascading disasters. Gary did a wonderful job talking about what's in the climate vulnerability assessment. I want to point out a few more things. I think we need Chris Hannon to come off mute and screen. We wanted to focus this panel about workers. As Gary noted in his presentation, the analysis that's been done with the climate vulnerability assessment just underscored what we learned in the last 2 years of the pandemic, that workers are really at the center of both vulnerability and resiliency, right? So a couple of things I want to highlight that's in the vulnerability assessment. I know we're going to drop a link in again, but I encourage everybody to take a look at it who's following along, all 187 participants, to really look at it. It's a tremendous resource, very accessible, great maps. A few things that I think are highly, highly relevant to this discussion. One is this cascading climate impacts analysis that's really fantastic in the vulnerability assessment. Talks about what happens when you have high heat waves, for example, extreme heat, wildfires, right? And then it leads to electrical outages, how that cascades and creates even more vulnerability. So that's really important for us to realize how central that cascading impact, because we felt it. We felt it 2 years ago in 2020, and we're likely to feel it again. It's not just one type of event, they cascade onto each other. But as part of that cascading impact, what we realize is workers are at the center of this, right? In particular, workers who are outdoors, workers who, we noted, like domestic workers who may not live in places that are affected by wildfire, but they're affected because they need to be able to get out. So they're exposed to extreme heat and the smoke from wildfires. So that's an important part. And finally, the final thing in this report that I think is important to note, which we're going to hear about on this panel, is in order to respond to these climate change impacts that we know are going to happen, we have to have strong collaboration among municipal entities, industry, community-based organizations, the public, labor, all of that. So that's what we're going to try to pull together in this panel. We're going to hear from four really amazing folks who have each have a distinct perspective on this. So I want to actually start out with Professor Park, Jae-Sung Park from UCLA. Professor Park, you examine market failures, right? Particularly in the context of climate change and how the market does or does not respond to social and economic outcomes. I know you've read this report. Quick question to you. What stood out to you in this climate vulnerability assessment, particularly around climate change and workers? This is your field. What stood out to you? And what would you hope that planners and policymakers and business folks would take away from kind of a high-level summary of this report?
First of all, thank you for convening this event, for the invitation to participate. I feel like it is a very timely set of issues we're talking about. To me, the things that stood out most was, one, the emphasis on the workforce, and two, the emphasis not only on vulnerability per se, but the potential variation in vulnerability across different types of workers, across different racial groups, across different kinds of environments that people are working in. If I may, just to set a little bit of context and some data, globally, there are over 1.3 billion workers working either in agriculture, construction, or manufacturing. In the United States, over 65% of the roughly 100 million workers without a bachelor's degree report routine exposure to harsh environmental conditions on the job. And as Gary mentioned at the outset, this is both outdoor workers, agriculture, construction, et cetera, but also some quote unquote indoor workers, warehousing, manufacturing, auto repair, et cetera. And so just on that note, to give you a couple of data points to sort of solidify what we're talking about here, and what I really appreciated about the assessment is we're only recently beginning to learn just how insidious and damaging the footprints of heat are on the workforce. So in some work that my colleagues at UCLA and the World Bank in California actually increases the risk of workplace injury by anywhere between 5 and 10%, such that on any given year already, right, not in the future, upwards of 25,000 workers may be seriously injured on the job due to heat. And the thing I want to note here, and Gary alluded to this, is that it's not only the heat illnesses, right, the physical manifestations that are obviously related to heat. It's actually more subtle things like falling off of a ladder, getting your hand caught in a machine, being hit by a moving vehicle. All of these things that just become that much more likely, that much more damaging in a hotter world. And it doesn't actually have to be the extreme heat waves, the 120-degree days. We actually find that 80, 85, 90, 95-degree days have this sort of almost like a slow burn that is hotter for those who are more vulnerable, who are more exposed, either because of occupation or in the case of LA County in particular, right, due to the dynamics of the housing market, which tend to sort individuals along income groups in ways that lead lower income groups to be more exposed. These are some of the things that lead to variation in vulnerability, which the data suggests is very important, and which the report highlighted in an important way.
That's great. Thank you so much for pointing out that this is also about indoor workers too. So we have, as we noted, if you don't have access to electricity or air conditioning, some of those warehouse workers don't. They may be indoors, but they're in an air conditioned setting.
Right.
Thank you so much, Yusun. I want to pull in Elizabeth Rhodes. Elizabeth is the LA County Public Health Director of Climate Change and Sustainability Program. And in the report, we've got amazing maps and tables. It really helps us understand the severity and how it'll be experienced throughout LA. But one of the key findings of the report is that there are some highly vulnerable populations who aren't easily represented by maps, right? And Gary talked a little bit about that on outdoor workers in some of his discussion. So that population is people who are climate exposed at work. For extreme heat in particular, exposure at work may be compounded by an inability to recover in their home environment among climate exposed workers, like landscapers who both work and live in places with no or poor thermal regulation. That's directly out of the report. So they're exposed to work, they may be able to get home, but they're going home to an extremely hot environment, for example. So as a public health person, Elizabeth, how do you deal with this? If you look ahead at climate impacts, how do you deal with mitigating this type of broad public health danger in a place as large and varied as Los Angeles?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And thanks for inviting me to be here. This is really great. And I appreciate the leadership of all the speakers here today. I think, you identified a major issue, which is people who are exposed at their workplace and then they're exposed at home. And what that really reminded me of was a series that ran in the LA Times last year, a really excellent series that did an outstanding job of covering the health impacts of heat and some of the failures, frankly, in government response. And in the article, they profiled people who had died in heat waves in Southern California. They spoke with their family members. And one of the people they profiled who had died was a man named Jorge Valerio Santiago, who worked in construction. He became ill at work during a heat wave. He went home to a trailer that didn't have air conditioning and was later found dead. And I think tragedies like that really hit home that there are a number of things that we can do to support people in their workplaces, but also in their homes. So from a government perspective, like you said, from a health perspective, we can first expand our understanding. So modeling and forecasting the health impacts, what we're going to be seeing in the future, and also a better understanding of the resources that people need to cope with extreme heat, particularly how they want to cope in their homes or what strategies are best for our communities so that we can implement those strategies. We want to expand our ability to identify and reach populations with messaging. So that would include, for example, direct outreach to people through existing home health services or through CBOs, implementing a program like the Be a Buddy program that exists in New York City, where people check on their neighbors during extreme heat events. There's work being done training physicians and other healthcare professionals on best practices for teaching their patients how to protect themselves from health impacts. So like various ways to reach people. We can expand energy assistance programs, home weatherization, installing passive and active cooling systems in homes. Something I'm also particularly interested in is how we make cool spaces more accessible and attractive to people, and partner with alternative cool spaces like pools and water features and museums and movie theaters. And then, of course, urban heat island reduction is a really important component of all of that for resilient cooling.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth. That was quite a laundry list, and but it speaks to, these are some common sense things that we can take on right now. I want to pull Chris Hannon into our conversation. Chris is the executive secretary for the LA Orange County Building Trades Council. And Chris, you represent many of the workers who face this kind of climate vulnerability and who are truly the linchpin of the region's infrastructure, particularly in energy and transportation. How have you begun to think about addressing these types of health threats to your members, and how might we safeguard the their health during the next multi-day extreme weather event and wildfire event that blankets the region with smoke and punishing heat? How are you guys thinking about how to help your members?
Good morning, Cecilia. Good morning, everybody. And thank you for having the building trades as a participant in this valuable discussion. I think building trades unions have done a good job over the last number of decades educating and training members. But I think we have to remember that we only represent a portion of the outdoor workers. We have over 140,000 members here in Los Angeles and Orange counties, but there's a lot of construction workers who are unrepresented. There are thousands upon thousands of construction workers working in the residential construction industry. There's farm workers. There's many other workers that are exposed to the elements, outside of construction and specifically outside of unionized construction. I think many times we think of the need for a union as a way to improve our economic mobility or economic justice, but being a member of the union and expanding the workers' opportunities to be members of unions also expands upon an opportunity to give voice to the worker and to make sure that when we have guidelines from Cal OSHA that require plans being in place, requiring shade to be available, requiring fresh water, requiring employers to be able to give a worker a break, even if it's outside of your normal breaks. If somebody's feeling the effects of the elements, workers need to be not only educated about these rights, but they also need to be educated about exposure and the dangers to exposure. With the climate events becoming more and more severe and happening at all times of the year. And I think, it's been pointed out, our weather last week, some of the initial events of high temperature and exposure, when people aren't conditioned for that, I think those are some of the most dangerous times. And some of the times when employers may not have a plan in place to protect workers, I think the role of our unions in getting the word out, not only for our members, but trying to get it out there for all workers within the construction industry, and our county Federation of Labor can play a role getting the word out to all workers about, making sure that you protect yourself, making sure that you recognize when you're vulnerable, and to be able to take a moment to protect your safety. There's just so many things going on, and there's so many hazards at work, specifically in our industries. One hazard that we may not be aware of is thinking about exposure to heat. In other areas of the country or other areas of the world, you could be thinking about exposure to severely cold weather. Here, the dangers are equally as critical for exposure to very high temperature.
Thanks, Chris. And then thanks for pointing out that, it's that general education of all workers, unionized or non, that is critical, right? To get folks to start thinking about it. I want to pull in Mary Leslie, who, I got to say, Mary, you've been a long time head of the LA Business Council. You served for a while on the independent system operator for the state of California. You're who I turn to when I think about how can the business community be a little more proactive around anything related to climate. You've had LABC really been on the forefront of solar work, on taking a look at the electric transportation infrastructure. So I know you've taken a look at this report. How would you talk to your members about this? And what are some of the models you think we can turn to on how the business community might deal and plan for these types of events that are just cascading and increasing in severity and frequency?
Well, thank you, Cecilia, and good morning. And it's great to be here with Supervisor Mitchell and the Insurance Commissioner, Laura, and Fran Pavley and her whole team at the Schwarzenegger Institute, and of course, the expert leaders on this panel. I think this conversation about how to equitably and effectively adapt to a changing climate is critical. I want to thank Gary Giro and his team for completing this report on LA climate vulnerability assessment. I didn't realize it was part of SB 379 legislation, but now I do. And especially getting this thing done in the middle of a COVID pandemic, it was Herculean. So as Gary said, this climate vulnerability assessment, we're just trying to get our handle on the tool. It's got the hazard assessment, the social vulnerability assessment, the physical vulnerability assessment, and the cascading impact assessment. And I'm with you. I love the cascading impact assessment because it shows how things compound. I also really like the online mapping tool. We actually, Cecilia, used it to apply it to some work we're doing with the transformative climate communities. This is work out in Pacoima and Sun Valley that we started about 4 or 5 years ago as part of the state of California's efforts to work on these issues. For the past 5 years, we've been working with Pacoima and Sun Valley on how to deal with climate change. I think the transformative climate communities should be brought into this conversation because, as you know, for the last 6 or 7 years, we've been making large grants to groups all over the state. Now, when we apply this vulnerability assessment to Pacoima and Sun Valley, we see that they are in the 94 to 102 extreme heat category. We see that this is the highest heat index in this tool. We see that the social sensitivity index is high in this area as well. It shows that these communities have increased exposure to climate hazards with higher sensitivity, susceptibility, and negative impacts of exposure. So we're thinking we can use the tool out there to educate members of the community that we work with about the urgency and how to get ready to prepare for it. We have a coalition made up of GRID, Land for the Public Trust, City of LA, Department of Transportation, LA Conservation Corps. We would encourage them to use this tool, dig down harder. And then, of course, to your point, Cecilia, I would share this with the LABC members to get them up to speed that it exists and how they can apply it to the work that they do. As you know, a lot of our members are our contractors in construction, our architects. Architects actually are some of the best people to try to impact because they design things and they renovate things. So if they understand what's going on. So anyway, I think I thank and applaud the county for doing this and Gary and his team.
Thanks, Mary. So we probably have time. There have been a bunch of questions that have been in the Q&A portion of this webinar, and some have been answered. Some of them are in a lot of different. I'm going to go straight to our lightning round and see if we can fit in one last lightning round question to the whole group. And then if we have any time, we'll try to hit one of those questions from the Q&A. But let's go kind of in reverse order, actually, if that's okay. Mary, here's the lightning round question. What's the one thing that, in 30 seconds, the one thing you would advise great chair of the Board of Supervisors, Holly Mitchell, and whoever our incoming LA mayor may be, to help workers who are vulnerable to climate change impacts? What's the one thing you'd ask those two leaders to do, I guess, from your perspective, from the business community, to help?
Yeah, I have kind of two thoughts about that, but I'll say it in 30 seconds. One is, the kind of protocols we have around earthquake preparedness would be, at a minimum, a protocol has to get developed. And also, the role of the utility industry. I am vice chair of the independent systems operator right now. I'm really aware of the state grid situation. I mean, the idea that utilities shouldn't be at the table for this, they should, because Edison and DWP here will have a really disproportionate role in some of these issues.
So emergency preparedness and pulling people together on a table, including the utilities.
Yeah, utilities need to be at the table.
That's great. Chris, what about you? What's the one thing you'd say to Supervisor Mitchell, or chair of the Board of Supervisors Mitchell, and our new future LA mayor? Hey, here's what you can do to help us on this work with workers.
I think the best thing we could do is improve access. The county, through so many different means of communication and so many different contact points with the residents of the County of Los Angeles, I think being able to provide informational updates on things like heat exposure, the dangers, these significant heat waves, including the fires. I think, by enabling not only whether it be labor or the business community to be able to be a part of those, public service announcements, and it doesn't just have to be in an external. There's communications coming all the time from the county, allowing us to have a chance to be a part of that, I think might be reinforcing to the community residents.
That's a great idea. Professor Park, what's the big ask you would make of a Supervisor Mitchell or our new mayor? Yeah,
I would say that I think there's an opportunity here to use big data to our advantage to experiment with and possibly fine tune the policy response, because especially in the context of workers in the workplace, there's always, as everyone on this call I'm sure recognizes, there's always a balance, right, between benefits and costs, and striking that balance is actually a non-trivial endeavor, as we've learned, right, with the COVID pandemic and our responses to it. And so I think we have an opportunity to get ahead of the very extreme heat that's coming down the pike, to really use the data that is being generated every day, whether we know it or not, the big data in our midst, to see if we can fine tune that response so that the policy response, while helping the workers avoid heat-related impacts, also ensures that economic growth in these communities continues, right, in a way that we'd like.
That's a great suggestion. It sort of calls to mind that tracking and ranking of heat events that Commissioner Lotta mentioned, if his legislation is passed. And Elizabeth, we're going to give you the last word. We're going to ask the question a little differently for you. Since you sit here as a county official and can't really tell your boss what to do, or maybe even the mayor, not that any of the rest of us can either, but I guess I'd say the question for you is, what would you ask your fellow panelists, who are pretty important in their own realm, what could they do to help you, sitting at public health, better respond to the impending threats of climate impacts on workers?
Thanks. Yeah, I really liked everybody else's responses. I think, collaboration is probably, the key. It's always a difficult ask in huge counties like LA. We have so many stakeholders, but coordinating on this issue, I appreciated, the expertise of everybody on the panel. And I think, continued collaboration. And this is our responsibility in government too, reaching out to all of this relevant stakeholders. So that's what I would say.
Thank you. Well, look, we're just about at time. I want to say this. I want to thank all the panelists. I definitely want to thank Gary Giroux and his team for getting this amazing study done. Please, please, please take a look at it if you're following us online. But just to kind of cut to the chase, this is something that's going to take collaboration, as Elizabeth noted. It's going to mean using all kinds of methods of communications, as Chris noted, and having alternate messengers, not just officials, but alternate messengers who can reach your particular constituencies through all these different medium. As Professor Park noted, we have great big data. Let's use it. Let's target it so that folks know that when we call for an emergency, as Mary Leslie noted, if we start to activate what we've done really well on earthquake preparedness, if we do the same thing for heat events, flooding events, wildfire events, that we do it appropriately using big data and give people concrete, specific actions they can take. Elizabeth, your list of potential actions was an excellent one about cooling centers, alternative cooling centers, giving people breaks from their work, even if it's not their break time. These are great ideas, but we need to put it together because the next step is working collaboratively across LA County. We've got a good track record of doing that. So the thing is, we need to pivot and take a look at this from a climate resiliency perspective. With that, thank you to the Schwarzenegger Institute, to UCLA Luskin Institute, to LA County, to LA Business Council. Everybody, stay safe out there. Get ready for the next extreme event.